Okay, Shalom Aleichem, everyone. Guess we'll do with the mic just so to save our voices. Yashar koach everyone for coming. Before we even begin, I'll just introduce the Rabbeim from closest to me to closest out. We have over here of Elan Segelman, who is the Mar de Asra in Young Israel of Hinkak Park in Los Angeles. Came all the way from LA to here. Next time we have Rav Daniel Feldman, who's the Mar de Asra in Or Sadia in Teaneck, New Jersey. And then we have next to him is Rav Baruch Goldstein from Brooklyn. The name of the shul is Ner Lamea. And then to the right of Rav Goldstein is Rabbi Lebowitz, who's the Rav of Beis Knesset of North Woodmere over here, amongst other things as well. So basically what we're trying to do today is to give people a view inside the halachic process of what happens. Everyone sitting here in the panel are Mar de Asras of communities, and Rabbeim in this position get questions all the time, and a lot of them are very outrageous and wild. So the goal now is basically just to give you an experience of what happens from the eyes of the Mar de Asra when he gets a question, and then how he breaks it down all the way down to the modern day poskim. So the goal would be everyone is going to present a question, and the other Rabbeim are basically going to either interject, hopefully. Yes, we're encouraging interjection at any point. And then we'll take it from there. We'll discuss a few different Shailos, and hopefully you'll be able to see what it's like to paskin outrageous Shailos. Who should we start with? Rabbi Segelman. Chabad.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
And thank you to Rav Elyada for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to speak in this very chashuv event with the very chashuv rabbanim. I guess the Smichas Chaver program, we're beginning Hilchos Nida. So we'll share a Shaila that comes up in Hilchos Nida in Kuf Pei Hey.
I'll be the first one to interject already. Rav Segelman is the head of Mechon Puah in America, one of the heads of Mechon Puah in America, which is basically a fertility treatment center in Eretz Yisrael and also here in America. So he gets a lot of these Shailos. And he's very, very experienced in all these
Capital
things.
outrageous, yeah.
Exactly.
We'll start with something basic and we'll see where the event takes us. But in the beginning of Hilchos Nida, in the beginning starts with Kuf Pei Gimel, but in Kuf Pei Hey, we're taught about a halacha that a woman, when she returns from the mikvah, she needs to declare that she is tahora, that she has gone to the mikvah, that she is now tahora. The basic idea is that as she leaves the home to go to the mikvah, she left with a chezkas tuma, and for her to return and to be intimate with her husband, she needs to reestablish that chezkas tahara. Last the husband saw her, she was tmeya. Now they need to reestablish the chezkas tahara. And we'll discuss, I'm sure, in the Chabura, what does the woman actually need to say? Does she actually need to declare and say those words, tahira ani or tavalti? We'll get into those halachos. But the Pischei Tshuva, in the bottom of that halacha, mentions a case where a woman is chashuda al harayos, which means that let's say she had an affair. Let's use that example. While she was married to this individual, and the shaila is, does she still have that same ne'emanus when she comes back from the mikvah and says, Tehira ani? Well, it's very nice that you're saying Tehira ani, but you don't really have the most wonderful track record, and how can I trust you? So a shaila that I've received, I'm sure it could be that the Rabbanim here have received it as well. It's an unfortunate shaila, and what I think is more unfortunate is that I'm pretty sure it's common, where a woman who is suffering from OCD, this specific case, a woman was suffering from OCD, and part of her mental health issue was that she wasn't able to bring herself to the mikvah. Of course, she was a frum woman, but she wasn't able to dunk in the mikvah. She felt the water wasn't clean enough. Whatever her mental health reasons were, she couldn't physically bring herself to go to the mikvah, but she also couldn't tell her husband that she wasn't going to the mikvah. So for years, she would leave on Leil Tevila, and she would do whatever she was doing. She would stay out of the house for an hour or so. Maybe she would wet her hair. And then she would come home and she would return and present herself like she had gone to the mikvah. And at a certain point, it ate her up, and she confided in the therapist that she wasn't going to the mikvah, but she was going home and she was continuing to live intimately with her husband, not going to the mikvah. The shaila that a Rav receives, either from the woman confides in the Rav or in the therapist, we have this piece of information. We know that she is not going to the mikvah, but she is continuing to be intimate with her husband. What is the role of a Rav? How does he get involved? Should he get involved? Must he get involved? What does he do with that piece of information?
Can I add to that, Shaila?
Please.
Well, what if the therapist implements a treatment plan and the woman gets to the point where she's able to go to the mikveh and she goes to the mikveh? And let's say the husband knew that for years she had fooled him and she hadn't gone to the mikveh. Does she have ne'emanos now that she goes to the mikveh? I mean, even going forward, now that she's able to go to the mikveh, does she have ne'emanos?
So the Pischei Tshuva discusses how a woman who was not loyal, how does she regain her ne'emanos? The poskim discuss a case of a couple that both began as non-frum Jews, and they were choser b'tshuva together, but the husband was choser b'tshuva quicker than the woman. She's not there yet. He wants to keep taharas mishpacha. She doesn't. And she says that she'll go to mikveh for him because she respects him. Again, they're both on their way back to being choser b'tshuva fully, but she's not there 100%. So the poskim discuss whether she has that ne'emanos to tell him that she's going to the mikvah when she herself isn't fully 100% religious at this point.
Getting back to Rabbi Segelman, Shiloh, there's a truth from the Chelkes Yaakov where he discusses that a doctor knows that a person's nebuch suffering from a certain ailment. I think one of the son, I think it was he had cancer, and he figured out that they were dating somebody, and they weren't disclosing the information. So he sent the Chelkes Yaakov Shiloh. Medically he's not allowed to reveal the privacy of the patient, and in a sense he's jeopardizing his job. What's he supposed to do? He knows that these two people are dating, and what's the halacha? Is he mechuyev to reveal it? On one hand, he's putting his job at stake. It's interesting. There is a Rabbi Akiva that discusses as a person when he's being over something b'shev al taisa, is he mechuyev to lose kol memoinoi? Is he mechuyev to lose all his money over here where he's jeopardizing his job? And he's only shev al taisa. He's staying in position by not revealing. Let's say like Sam al dam reyecha. He's not revealing something to his friend that he should really reveal.
In other words, the Ramah in Yeridea, the Ramah Kufnan Zayin says that a person is not obligated to give up all their money for a mitzvah saseh.
Right.
But when it comes to a mitzvah lo saseh,
He has to give kol money.
they have to give all their money.
Right.
So what would we do in a situation where you know that a woman is not going to the mikvah, and it's not lo samar al dam reyecha in the physical sense that he's going to be killed, but in a spiritual sense, lo samar al dam reyecha. There is a tshuva from the Maharshdam that says lo samar al dam reyecha applies not only to one's physical health, but to their spiritual health as well. But the lo samar al dam reyecha, one could argue, maybe is different than any other classic lav, because a classic lav, the way you violate it is bekum ve'aseh, doing an action. Stealing, killing. Here, the way you violate the lo saseh of lo samar al dam reyecha, don't stand idly by while a brother is in jeopardy, physical, spiritual. Here, the way you violate it is b'shev al taisa, by not doing anything. So what's the stress?
Right. So you have also a lot of times if someone's a nurse in the hospital, a patient could sign a DNR. They're also being b'shev al taisa. Are they mechuyev to go against the DNR that's being signed? But I think in Rabbi Segelman's case, I think there's a simple eitzah. To have a third party reveal it. The therapist herself should maybe tell it over to the Rav, and have the Rav disclose it to the husband and reveal it to him without let it being known that it was the therapist who revealed the information. And if it's done in a smart way, in a diplomatic way, it could be done.
It's a slippery slope. If the therapist is the only person who knows that information, and the information gets back to the wife, she's going to trace it back to the therapist. That's a violation of HIPAA.
Right. But if it's done that's true, but if it's done in a smart way, the husband, let's say, he wanted to get in touch with his wife, so therefore he had to call the mikveh, and they told her that she never came. It could be done in a certain way. I think it's shaykh to be done in a smart way that we could not put the therapist at.
So just to summarize, there's two Shailos over here that we're handling. Okay, Shiloh number one is: can the therapist say, meaning she's a religious Jew, and her patient is religious, and she knows that her patient is not going to the mikvah, right? So the question is she obligated to tell the Rav or to tell the husband? That's question number one, which we're not sure, right? We're going back and forth. Maybe we'll give like a final psak at the end. And then question number two is that even if word does get back to the husband, is she now in the future believed to go to the mikvah, right? If the next time she says, "Oh, I'm going," does she have ne'emanas? So why don't we go across the Ramban and we'll give a psak to each shaila, and maybe 30 seconds of explaining why it would be.
I happen to agree. I often agree with Rabbi Goldstein. He's a gewaldige Talmid Chacham and a dear chaver. I think the crux of the question is exactly what Rabbi Goldstein hit upon when the Ramah says that a person has to give up all their money not to violate a lav. Does that even apply to a lav which is b'shev tasa? You could argue in this case that it is kum v'aseh. You could argue in this case that it is b'kum v'aseh. The woman herself knows that she's doing something wrong, and insofar as her iser, she's b'kum v'aseh. There's a number of tshuvas that speak about very similar cases, and it's also tolu in that machlokes about if a person finds kalayim in their clothing, in the shuk. So there's two girsos. The Noda B'Yehuda points out there's two girsos in the Gemara. The Gemara in Brachos and Daf Yutes talks about a person that finds kalayim in their clothing. So the question is, does the person next to them who notices the kalayim, notices the shatnas, are they obligated to inform them and take the begadim off? So it depends. There's two different girsos. One girsa is hamotze kalayim bebigdo. So there you have to take it off. You have to remove it, even if you feel a b'shuk. Why? Because it's b'kum v'aseh. There's another girsa, hamotze kalayim b'shuk. Even someone else. And that someone else sees that a person in the shuk is wearing kalayim, you have to engage. You have to get involved. You have to initiate and to remove the kalayim. One final point, the Noda B'Yehuda writes that even according to a shita that would hold it's b'kum v'aseh, it's only, this case would be b'shev v'atase. The Noda B'Yehuda writes, if they're going to continue living this way, so everyone would agree you have to get involved. I think that the psak is that, yes, the therapist, the Rav, together have to find a clever and discreet way of informing the husband to prevent him from further isurim, and to address Rabbi Lebowitz's question, I think the poskim right, that if we're able to identify the reason why she wasn't going to the mikvah was not because she is anti-mikvah, she's anti-religion, but simply because of a mental health issue, when the therapist and the parties involved are confident that she's overcome her issue, she's overcome her OCD, whatever it may be, and they feel confident that she can be believed, then she will in fact regain her ne'emanos. Until then, he could speak to the balanit, he could speak to the mikvah lady to ensure that it was done properly.
So I'll just address some of the lamdisha points, and I'll leave the psak to the more esteemed rabbanim. But just as far as some of the details, so one of the issues in terms of losamad al dam reyecha, so it's interesting because the way the Rambam formulates it in Sefer HaMitzvos, it does clearly apply to much more than just mortal risk. It's really any degree of risk, whether it's material, spiritual, physical, all of it's included in losamad al dam reyecha. But some of the poskim do distinguish as far as having to give up all your money. There's a more extreme version of losamad, and there's a less extreme version that only when it's actual death do they apply losamad in the absolute sense. You'd have to give up everything, and the lower gradations of losamad may not be subject to the same standard. The question of whether we apply giving up all your money when it's a question of passive versus active is a suffix that went back to the Bikur Yaakov and all the others who it comes up in a couple places. And it's interesting, it connects also to one of the points that you mentioned, because this chiluk between active and passive comes up also in terms of Kavod Abrios, which is the subject of the Noda B'Yehuda's Shuvah, and it comes up in the context of Akiras Davrim and HaTorah, and each one they have that whole question whether it's the same kind of standard. And it's Tosas and Shavuos that one day in Tosas, 2 days in Tosas and Shavuos, one of the days in Tosas and Shavuos is that if somebody else is going to be active based on your passivity, so then that's called active. I mean, that was the svara that you mentioned would probably come into play over there. So as far as the obligations of a therapist or somebody like that, whether it means giving up all their parnasa. So I think some of the poskim would say there's a lot of literature about this in terms of the Tzitz Eliezer and the Bavaji Yosef and Nachum Ravinowitz says the truth about this. It may depend on if we're talking about actual death or not. That really requires intervening no matter what. But something less than that, there might be room for another cheshbon, especially also because it's not just about the parnasa, it's about the future parnasa, which is a higher standard also, but also that he's not going to be able to help anyone else. So a part of the ability to continue to help people is also built into that whole question. But sometimes there is room for another party, especially if the shidduchim question, there is room for another party to get involved. It's more difficult for a therapist because a therapist really is going to be traced as the only person. But so, for example, though, as a Rebbe, so we're only bound by halacha and not bound by the same kind of ethical requirements that have other kinds of standards. So I would tell the person directly that I'm going to feel mechuyev to reveal it. If you don't reveal it, then try to get them to reveal whatever it is through that, and hopefully you won't have to necessarily be in the compromised position. They also wonder in terms of regaining the amanas, so perhaps the standard that Rav Moshe brought up in terms of kashrus, that it's not just about your halachic behavior, but it's also about real world credibility. So if somebody is trying to change and their whole, especially they're going to have a higher threshold of being believed because they have a history of not being believed. So I wonder if that might create even a stronger chazaka if they know that their whole ability to be trusted now from here in Mekana Lahaba is contingent on being 100% honest with no wiggle room. I wonder if that might be a basis to create a new kind of chazaka.
She has a history.
Right, but the history is causing her now to, from when she's ready to be makabel from here on in, that since it's going to be on probation, so to speak, so the burden of being honest is even more than the average person. She can't afford any mistakes. I don't know, that maybe create a different kind of chazaka. I don't know.
Sure, I went to the Lebowitz to give you a chance. I spoke earlier,
What was with the Chalkas Yaakov?
Right, the Chalkas Yaakov, and I believe that if it's done in a correct way, it can be done without tracing it back to the therapist. It's a very interesting tshuva you mentioned in the night of Yehuda, an amazing tshuva of Kol Yimei Chayav.
Want to share the case with the
It was a very interesting case that a person, unfortunately had relations with a married woman, and he wanted to be chayz l'tshuva because his mother-in-law.
Yeah, right. He was living in her house as a bacher, and he had relations with the balas habayis, and then he later ended up marrying their daughter. And he was married to his his mother-in-law was the woman with who he had these relations with, and because of those relations, so really the mother-in-law was usher to her husband, his father-in-law. The question that he asked the Nod Yehuda was, is he obligated to disclose that information, given the fact that it was a chashuva family, it would create a tremendous pagam hamishpacha, tainted reputation in the community. The question was this individual obligated to reveal and disclose that information?
I have one prior to it, actually, before I go into it, because there are other tshuvas that argue on the Nod Yehuda on that. I think the Divrei Chaim, right. And I think the minig, I think Rav Shecht's point, the minig is like the Divrei Chaim on that, to be more makel on that. So as far as the svara that the Nod Yehuda has, that specifically because it's going to happen again and again, that's a greater level of chumrah. Right. So here, especially if she's planning on changing, that may change that cheshbon, and also especially if the minig is not like the Nod, I don't know if that also changes the cheshbon.
It's interesting how you see like a certain tshuvas had a poskim address it, like they start the tshuva that we have to find the heter for this person. Just the question is how to navigate and go about it. Yeah. Like we're discussing, Thursday night by the Rabbanim conference about the Shailos which took place with, unfortunately, a Beis Yaakov girl who in her adulthood had some difficult years. And unfortunately, she had relations and she had an abortion. And she made a grave mistake by not telling, Baruch Hashem, she was chayze b'tshuva, and she made a grave mistake by not telling her chassan her past. And they had a child, they had a boy, and the husband's all excited. He's going to make a pidyon haben, he's getting ready, he's calling the caterer, inviting all his friends. And here his wife knows the truth, that it's not really a pet rechem. It's not the firstborn. And here she's faced with a dilemma. If she tells him what happened, that's it. It's, could be so aggravating to the husband. He'll become agitated. It could end their marriage. But mitzad sheni, if she doesn't say anything, what's going to be? You're going to have the kohen, the father, the son. He's making brachas, bracha levatalas, leisisa. And you see how the poskim address this shaila. They start off how we have to come up with a heter that we could go through this pidyon haben. The question is how. Of course, in the realm of halacha, which in a sense, as Rabbanim, which Rabbi Elyada pointed out, really the point of the panel is we as Rabbanim, what we're faced with, that you have to know when, but there are certain times that you try to Mit darf sich in der Heter noch a Yid. You know, you have to try to find the heter, and of course, everything has to be in the realm of halacha. But even though a lot of times we take the high road to always live l'chumra, but there's some times when it comes, let's say, to cover abrius or to shalom bayis and things like that, we try to even stick to the letter of the law just to be matzel and save the case, like this tshuva of Yabi Emery mentions in Yabi Yehuda. But it's definitely it's dealt with a lot of sensitivity. Absolutely.
We could add to that, the really outrageous thing is how often that seemed to come up, because there's a lot of tshuvas about it. Is the tshuva in the Marashag? Is the tshuva, Bavaji has a tshuva, actually Daron has a tshuva, there's a number of tshuvas about it. And it's interesting also in terms of the sensitivity, because I once wrote about that issue, and somebody wrote to me very angrily that you're advocating lying between spouses and there's not going to be any trust. And I said, I'm not advocating anything. There's a point to question of halacha in terms of when it's appropriate to, that really a Shailos just l'shanos from the Hashalom. And the point is, you first have to figure out whether it's going to help or not, and then you can figure out how to apply the halacha. So this woman who was arguing said she has to assume that it's never going to come up. You can't say it's never going to come up. So when you ascertain that it's proper for this situation, so then there's a whole body of literature to apply and to know whether it's appropriate or not. And that's also a part of the sensitivity of it.
Just to go back to the two questions, yeah? Okay. So as far as the question whether the therapist should tell, not only will therapists lose their license, but as Rabbi Feldman alluded to, they'll also lose the ability to help other people. Rav Nachum Rabinovich has a tshuva about this, as Rabbi Feldman alluded to, and he points out that it's not just that that therapist is going to lose the ability to help other patients. Every from therapist is going to lose the ability to help other patients. Meaning, if everyone knows that a from therapist, whenever it comes to a matter of halacha, is going to reveal to other people something that's going to, something that was told to them in confidence, no one will ever go to a from therapist, because they're going to know that they can't trust the from therapist, and that would be tragic for the community to not have the ability to have access to from. We need more from therapists. I'm sure all four of us could be maskim. It's really, really, really important for our community. And when you go to a non-from therapist, I'm sure they're wonderful, but you spend 10 sessions just like describing what Shabbos is before you could even get to like your description of what your OCD about Shabbos is. It's such a waste of time and money, and we really need. So I think Rav Nachum Rabinovich mentions that svara. David Lichtenstein had an interview with Dr. Fox just in last night's podcast. I was driving somewhere and I was listening, and Dr. Fox mentioned the same idea that it's very important that we have from therapists, and it could be a bigger losam al dam reach on the entire Jewish community if therapists go around revealing information. Again, sometimes there's an eitzah, but sometimes there's no eitzah. As far as regaining the amanos,
So therefore, the therapist should not disclose at all, or the therapist should not disclose in a way that it'll trace back to him or her.
you gotta use chachma. You gotta figure it out. Sometimes it means not to disclose at all. It's also Rabbi Novich, if I recall correctly, I'm sure Rabbi Feldman could correct me, says that it's not so pashut that the person has nemanos in the first place. Meaning, a woman says, "I haven't been going to the mikveh." I don't believe you. You haven't been going to the mikveh. We have no evidence that you haven't. So it could be that she doesn't even have nemanos to say that she hasn't been going to the mikveh. That's another sniff he uses over there. And as far as regaining nemanos, so Rabbi Segelman's idea of speaking to the balanit, speaking to the mikveh lady, to verify that she was there. There's someone that watches the tefillah. That works. But I once had a case where a newly married couple, they've been married for 6-7 months, and the wife had just confessed to her husband that she's been having such issues with bleeding and staining and this and that she's just been going to the mikveh once a month, but a lot of times she was tamei, other times, and she just hasn't, because she just couldn't deal with it. So basically, she's been anida for a while without having told him, and it wasn't about lying about going to the mikveh; it was about lying about being anida. So then we're going to need something else, some other way to. So as Rabbi Feldman alluded to before, sometimes a commitment, a lifestyle change, where someone goes through something where you see a clear indication that they're looking to change and to improve, can help a person regain nemanos. That's what the Gemara says in Masech Sanhedrin, that a person who's an aid puzzle can become an aid kasher. The Gemara has pretty high standards of how to do that. You have to go to somewhere where nobody knows you and have faced the same nisayon, and and not succumb to the nisayon. It's a little bit difficult to do, but there are tshuvas in Rishonim and Gaonim already about how you could see over time, if a person over time you see that they clearly did tshuva, that they can regain ne'emanus.
Okay, Ashkach. Another that was supposed to be 10 minutes, but it wasn't. In the past 3 days, I was traveling a lot with Rav Shacht and Rav Amar, and when I was in the car with Rav Amar in Miami, so we get a phone call and it goes on speaker, and the question was as follows: there is a person who is in need of a kidney, and he has a very rare, blood type, and they did a shul-wide, drive. I don't know exactly how to find the match, but there was one person who was the match in the whole community, and it happens to be it's this person's cousin, which is usually fairly common. So he's very excited, and he wants to donate the kidney and save his cousin's life. Problem is, his wife is not happy at all about him donating, and they have a rocky, marriage as it is. And she basically told him, if you donate the kidney, I'm going to divorce you. That was the question that was presented to Rav Amar on the speakerphone, and he said, "Okay, well, what should we do?" So, what would the Rabbanim say in such case? You have a Shaila of pikuach nefesh, you have a Shaila of divorce over here that you will probably. She says this will be like tomorrow. I'm out. I'm packing my bags. So, if you would get a Shaila like this, what would you?
So there's a tshuva from the Radvaz about giving away an aver. The Radvaz makes an analogy. He says that if a person is not mechuyev to give away kol memoinoi, so for sure he's not mechuyev to give away an aver. Yechavadas Chamavadi has a tshuva about this child donating a kidney, and he says a person is not obligated to. He says Allah. He goes back and forth all the shitas, and I'm sure we'll hear more. But in the tshuva, he goes through Kedarki B'Kodesh. He goes through Mamish Chamavadi. His tshuvas they're unbelievable. Mamish Kol Tarakul in front of him, and he goes back and forth in different Gemaras and different sugis. And over there, he says that he comes to Elamaisa. One is not obligated al pi halacha. It's a nice thing, he says, but one is not mechuyev to do it. So I would venture.
What is that based on? That's based on the medical metzias of the time, because there's a certain risk involved, and a person is not obligated to risk their lives for the pikuach nefesh. If that's the case, I'm not exactly sure what the metzias is, but I think one could argue that now the metzias is that it's safer than ever, and the doctors are very confident that the risks involved are minimal.
Right, so he addresses that, but he says that at the end of the day, since the Eibusher gave us 2 kidneys, there has to be a benefit to it, or else the Eibusher never would have gave it to us. So, and I think he wrote the tshuva in the 80s, I think.
Donate.
What? There's to donate it. But I think the Mechas Yitzchak also has a tshuva on it, right? The Mechas Yitzchak also discusses the Shiloh. Even Stam, even that. Yeah. Right, he's going Stam, is there a person who wants to...
What is the Shalom Darshan?
He's Machar, he has to do with it. Has a tshuva about it. I think he was. There is a lot of back. We talked about this with Zilberstein a little bit. Some of these cheshbonos. Yes. 3 years ago, I guess last time.
We discussed about parents, not
parents. Yeah. So there's kibbud av aim. Also, it goes in both directions. The parents don't want. The parents want the kidney. Right. That was also. So there's a lot of cheshbonos. There's a lot of literature about it, which goes back and forth. And of course, as Rabbi Segelman was alluding to, it changes by the minute because the numbers change. So the question is there any realistic sakana or not? I mean, presumably some degree of sakana, but sakana changes as the science advances. So it's constantly in flux, Shiloh. But then, the question of, we talk about a wife objecting, will she get over it? Will it destroy their marriage? Is he really being asked to give up his marriage, not rather than to do this? Are there any other options? Is it the best option? There's so many moving parts that it's very hard to.
So let's assume this is the Metzias. What would you find?
So what is Metzias? He's the only one.
He's the only one.
It's a very difficult. Sorry.
That's why Rabbi.
I always thought that the Radbaz as a model for some of these points was actually very difficult, because a lot of the poskim do work off the Radbaz, but it's a different consideration. So he's talking about somebody presumably, although in his time it may have been different, but presumably somebody can give up an arm and they'll live. So the question is, are you mechuyev to give up the functionality of the arm, knowing that you will live? And it's thought as a little bit of a pella that the later poskim use that Rabbaz to consider the question, where the question is, it's really just about will they die, and if they live, they'll live maybe with close to full functionality. The Rabbaz also talks about bizyonos there, also that's visibly evident. So it's going to so the whole it just kind of highlights how the math is different. So it seems if it's really only this person that it's hard to escape the L'samad al Dam Re'acha and hope that you can find them some good therapy and maybe get them back together again, which you'd have to imagine that eventually they will be able to get over this because it's such a wrenching kind of question. But it's if you flip it back to the kibbud avim question, where sometimes it comes up, the parent is the one who wants the kidney, and then if the spouse may not want. And there, if it's just about the kibbud avim part and there's other options, so that would also change the dynamic. There's a lot of moving parts. That's why I'm glad we have many others to turn to.
I would assume that if they're at that stage where she's saying, give me a kidney, I'm out, then clearly there's a whole host of other issues, and maybe that's just an excuse to find a way out. That's what I would say.
It could be, but it could be also that it's really a very sensitive issue for both, because she could really feel like you have a primary responsibility to worry about. You're being here for the family, and the fact that you're going to risk dying for maybe it's a stranger, like in this case, the cousin, right? But which also changes the dynamic because it changes the emotional dynamic. That if it was really a stranger, so the chiyuvim wouldn't be that different. It'd be b'sar chalo tisalim factor in the case of the cousin, but it's just a matter of degree. It's not a matter of whether the chiyuv is there in the first place or not. But from the emotional aspect, she'd say, listen, you have your achrayas to the family, and you might die, and you have however many kids, and we're going to be left alone. And that's to do that for a stranger is going. It could be a real thing, which doesn't necessarily have to be built on any kind of a history. It could be coming up there for the first time, but it could be. But I would think, from my totally ignorant perspective, that if it does come up from there out of nowhere, that they probably will eventually be able to get over it. But because she'll realize how conflicted he was and how much he really felt that he had no choice. And I would hope that ultimately should be able to forgive him. But I wouldn't say it's necessarily only coming from a place of other issues. It could theoretically be enough to cause the issue.
Delay it a little bit, and you get dialysis for some time and switch other communities, not yours as well as yours.
Yes. That was the question on the phone.
I have a lot to say on this topic, but I'm going to try to be makatzer. First of all, just to recognize that typically when someone is in need of a kidney, it's not the same as like if someone needs bone marrow. Meaning if you're a bone marrow match for somebody, you're very likely their only chance to live. Whereas by kidneys, usually it's much easier to find a match, meaning a much higher likelihood of finding a match. So usually it's not a situation where by saying I'm not going to donate that the person's going to die. Now the way the Metzius was presented in this case was that it's a very rare case. I was just asked a Shailos recently about a woman who matched for a 1-year-old child who needed a kidney. And that's also different than a normal kidney situation because they can only take kidney from a woman and she needs to be very petite. And so it's a very narrow field of people that can, and it's got to be an adult because children can't donate kidneys. So it's a very narrow field of people, and that changes the dynamics a lot. Rav Asher Weiss has a couple of tshuvas about this, and he writes that for a bone marrow donation, it's chiyuv gomer. He thinks it's you're their only chance, and there's no risk to you, and your bone marrow grows back. Like he thought it was, it's an obligation. For kidneys, he does not think. He says nowadays that it's so safe, so much safer than it used to be. As Rabbi Feldman pointed out, if you track the tshuvas, from the Minchas Yitzchak in the 1960s to Rav Vadia in the 1980s, to you just track the tshuvas as they go through history. It goes from Aser to Mutter to Mitzvah to Karov L'chiyuv. Rav Asher Weiss says Karov L'chiyuv. There's a tshuva of Vayan David of Tzat Dayan in Antwerp where he says if it's a close relative, it could be that it's a chiyuv. That if it's a spouse or something like that, that it could be that there's actually a chiyuv, but the level of need, meaning that you're the only match, and the level of of risk certainly play a huge role in terms of determining that. Now, when people ask me whether they should donate a kidney or not, the first question I always ask them is your husband or wife, depending on who's asking, on board? And not just like, okay, do what you want, but like on board, meaning are they really going to be there for you? Because you're going to have a recovery process and it's not going to be always so easy. It's going to take a few weeks and you're going to need a lot of help. And you don't want the person resenting all the help that they're giving you for those couple of weeks. So that's always the first question that's asked. I once asked Rav Asher Weiss, I said, you wrote that it's Karav L'Chiyuv, like really a Chiyuv? Like, what if a wife were to say that she doesn't want you to donate a kidney? He said, no, then you can't do it. So I said, and what if your wife were to tell you she doesn't want you to put on tefillin? So he said, well, you still got to put on tefillin. Meaning, so it's not a chiyuv. It's not the same level of chiyuv. But as the other Rabbanim suggested, I think in this case, she just let her spend some time with the cousin. See someone on dialysis. See what that looks like. See what living like that is. It's no life. And she'll gain an appreciation over time, I think, for the necessity of it, if it's taka true that this is her only chance.
I just think it's a very important lesson for Rabbanim, for everyone, especially when questions are outrageous. Outrageous questions are posed to Rabbanim. Rabbanim sometimes feel, maybe I'm speaking for myself, but there's a certain excitement, a certain thrill. We want to answer the Shaila. We want to go through the poskim. We want to discuss it with other poskim to see what the psak that we could give this individual, this couple, this family, whatever it is. Sometimes in psak, it's not about giving a psak. It's about evaluating the situation, analyzing the situation, and sometimes the answer is there is no psak, but let's wait. Let's work on one of the details. Let's have, if someone needs to see a therapist, if someone needs to work on something, so let's take that avenue as opposed to jumping to the bottom line psak, which may be outrageous, controversial, etc. But I think it's an important lesson for psak in general. It doesn't always it shouldn't always rush us to the bottom line. But sometimes there are other external factors which need to be considered, which will thereby hold us back from issuing and entering that psak.
Very often a shaila needs an eitzah. It doesn't need a psak. It needs
Exactly.
an eitzah. But can I ask what Rav Amar said?
Sure. What Rabbi Mar said on the spot was that in order to donate a kidney, there's a lot of tests that you need to get beforehand. So you need to fly to New York, and you would need to get tests to see if he's all the different deals. So he said start the process. He said start the process and see how that happens, which is like what the Rabbanim are saying. You're not really paskening, but you're trying to answer the question, not to.
She'll get used to it over time.
Yeah.
Is there halachas that you can't risk your life? Like 1 in 1,000, you survive.
If someone were to die donating a kidney nowadays, they would shut down the transplant unit in that hospital for years to figure out what went wrong, meaning it is a very low-risk procedure nowadays.
Are there any halachas? Why would you have to listen to your wife threatening divorce? What's relating to her? It's not such a big risk. Why can't you risk your life for what you want to do?
Lance is better than himself.
Okay, another interesting question that came from South Africa, and that is that the halacha is that a Kohen is not allowed to marry a Gioris. So there was a non-religious Jew who was married to a non-Jew, and he was choser b'tshuva, and he realized that through the process, his wife also decided that she's more inclined to be Jewish and she wants to be Mizgayer. Problem is, once she's Mizgayer, also before she's Mizgayer, he's usher to stay married. So, as through his halachic journey, he started going to Daf Yomi and he learned Yivamis. And in Yivamis, learned the Gemara that says that if a suadaka, someone who has, let's say, a vasectomy, right, is allowed to marry a Gioris. So he says, I have a great idea. He says, let me call up the doctor. He already has children that are not Jewish, but they married Jewish apparently. So his grandkids are Jewish. But he says, I want to, get a vasectomy, and then I'll be able to stay married to this Gioris. Is that something that Rabbi would encourage? And basically, if we were to really boil down the question is, do we prefer someone to do one Aveira, right, once, like a pretty big one, to avoid many more smaller Aveiras? So there's the Medrash Kliya, on Mikan Shishek on Shabbos by Avram Avinu. So I'll leave it in color. So what would be and it sometimes, by the way, it happens also with Bali Chuba couples that are being closer to Chuba. So the woman says, I can't do all Shivim Nikim and whatever I want to do, just the Dil rice. Right, so should I do that or not? Meaning just wait 7 days and then go to the mikvah instead of 5 plus 7.
I'll add a question that we get all the time in Pua. We deal with fertility-related questions. We deal with high-risk pregnancy questions. We deal with situations where women are unable to get pregnant, not because they want to be pregnant and they're longing to be pregnant, they're unsuccessful, but cases where it's unhealthy and unsafe for them to get pregnant. So they have to utilize some mode of contraceptive. Very often with these women, usually when you paint the picture of the Shaila, so all of the eitzes are usually knocked out. No, that's not good, that's not good. It usually boils down to the most intense. So very often we get the Shaila where a hormonal option is not an option. It's not a viable option for whatever reason. So this couple, given their medical situation, cannot get pregnant, meaning the doctors tell them they are not allowed to get pregnant. It could even risk their life, her life. She needs to utilize contraception. It can't be a hormonal option for whatever reason. So what are her options? She could either have a tubal ligation, tie her tubes, which would be a shaila of sirus. A woman is not allowed to become sterile. A man is not allowed to become sterile. An animal, you're not allowed to be misaris an animal. Or use a condom. Do you use a condom? In which case, every single bia will be a shaila of shechav zera levatala. So very often, so as I said before, usually the eitzes are knocked out. So the hormonal IUD is not an option. The non-hormonal IUD, sometimes the women have such a sensitive uterus that the uterus will push out, it will expel the IUD. So what do? Do you have the tubal ligation, which according to the Gra, Sirus Isha is an Isser Daraisa. According to many Rishonim, it's only the Rabbanan, but according to the Vilna Gaon, Sirus Isha, a tubal ligation, tying the tubes would be an Isser Daraisa. But it would only be once. It would be a one and done. Or do you use a condom, which is not the Shaila of Sirus Daraisa, but every bia, kol bia ubia, would have the Shaila of Shechva Zer Levatala.
Could you say it's not so pasha?
There is an element of pikuach nefesh. The question is, what's the best eitzah for this couple? Which one? Which do you prefer?
Which option to
Which
choose?
option is most halachically preferable?
No. 2 options protect her from death. Condom also protects her from death. The question is, which of the 2?
But it's affecting him. When you do the other one, it's only affecting her. And she's the one with the issue, not the man.
So it will be his shaila of shechva zer levatala. It may be well, they could also abstain. I'm just throwing it out. Okay. Yeah. Or it's an interesting point that you're mentioning that the different options. One would affect him and one would affect her, but both are halachically problematic to say the least. But we have to choose one because the couple can't live like that. Which is most halachically preferable?
Just to add, Rav Goldwicht mentioned that it's one Isser and it's a pretty big one. It's not so pashut how big it is in the sense that the doctor is violating a pretty big Isser by doing the Sirus, meaning to be a vet who does Sirus, that's a real problem. To be the person upon whom the Sirus is done is also Asr, may only be Amir La'akum, might be Lifnei Iver, but it's probably not Sirus when a person gets the procedure done. So it could be a lower level.
This is by force. It's done by force. But if you're going yourself and you're helping.
Again, Amir La'akum, or Lifnei Iver, perhaps if the Nachri is Mitzuva, that it's Lifnei Iver.
There's a Raya in Shabbos. In Ochel Shabbos, Allah is if someone is a Chola, let's say he's a Chola Sheish with Sakana, Allah says that you're allowed to be Mechal Shabbos for him, so is it better to feed him treif, which you have, right? There's enough treif to go around ready, and then every kazayas that he eats is going to be in a Daraisa. Or the other option is you take the cow and you shaft it, and then you cook it, and so that will be, you'll do, one isser, let's say you can eat it raw or whatever it is, one isser of shchita, and then every kazayas would be mutter. Right. So, what would be the psak?
All these
situations are very similar.
Is there a way to make a sterility through a grama being achri, or would you rather go with Achiezer that says that there's no issue of zil?
In terms of the tubal ligation, they had something called ishur. It was essentially what it was a coil that went into the fallopian tube, and they left it there. It wasn't now a tubal ligation. What they do now is they open it up, they tie, and then they cut. They tie the tubes and they cut the tubes. That's essentially what a tubal ligation is. There used to be a product on the market called ishur. It was a coil that would go into the fallopian tube, and it would stay there. And over the course of weeks and months, the scar tissue would develop around the fallopian tube, which would thereby block the sperm from coming into the tube. When that product was on the market, it was a good eitzah, because yes, it's a shaila of sirus isha, but it's done in a way of grama. Many poskim were more comfortable with that. The problem was they began to receive more and more lawsuits from the population. They took the product off the market. I believe it's still FDA approved, but they took it off the market, and therefore it's not a realistic option. In terms of the Achiezer, you're referring to Reb Chaim Oizer's psak, that in cases where it's pikuach nefesh and there's no other eitzah, Reb Chaim Oizer allowed for a condom to be used on the heter of pikuach nefesh and felt that it was derech bia, derech kol aretz. So there are heterim.
So back to our ger, what would you tell him?
I was the one that was asked the Shaila originally, so I could tell you what we did. I was asked by a Rav what he should do. I don't think he was really asking me the Shaila. I think he was asking me to be a go-between to ask Gedolim, because obviously this is not a Shaila that's answered on this level, on my level, certainly. So I asked Rav Schachter, Shlita, and Rav Schachter said, a person has to be a Navi to know how to answer such a Shaila. So I said, okay. I guess I'll try to find somebody else. So I asked Rav Yitzchak Zilberstein, and he said, absolutely not. You cannot tell him to do this procedure, to be Messiahs himself. And if he does it, don't be Megayer the wife. Like a really hard line. I asked Rav Asher Weiss, and Rav Asher Weiss said, look, you can't tell someone to do an Aveira. You could tell him that his cheshbon is correct, that if he does, he said, and look, at the end of the day, he's going to do it. And the guy's been living with a non-Jew for 20 years. He's going to go up Lachar Me'ev Esrim Shana and have one more Amir La'akum on his record. You can't tell him to do an Amir La'akum, but given the reality of the circumstance, if you look the other way and he does it, then you Megayah the wife.
And about Shuba couple that wants to do, they come to the Rabbi and say, you can only do 7 days. You want to do the Doraisa after 7 days? Without Shiva Nekiyim.
Right. So the Chumrah of Rabbi Zera of Shiva Nekiyim is something that's been accepted for 2,000 years. And the Gemara says that when a person davens, they should only daven mitoch halacha psuka. You shouldn't have something that's distracting before you daven. You should just learn something straightforward where there's nothing to question. Where it says kigon mai, what's a halacha psuka? Amar Rabbi Zera benos Yisrael l'chmir alatzman shaviu ros tibas tam chad yashus l'shav nekiyim. No matter that shiva nekiyim, that's for everybody. That's like that's a given. And you almost have very few examples, although Rabbi Feldman probably has like 50 that come to mind. You have very few examples in Shailos and Shuvas of when poskim are coming up with the snifim lahakel, where they say, maybe she's not a Zava Gedola anyway, she's more likely a Nida, not a Zava Gedola. However, there are examples where poskim do say that. You have Rav Goldstein has like that, and the Galia Masechta has like that. And I've seen Rav Schachter in certain circumstances where you don't have any other option. It has to be dealt with.
To add to the psak that you mentioned, Reb Zilberstein and Basher Weiss, Reb Moshe has also, he discusses, there's a shaila about a person, he was going to do one of two Isurim, one was the Rice and one was the Rabbanon. And Reb Moshe told the Rav that you're not allowed to tell him to do this. Even though it's a small issue, right? When it comes to B'kuach Nefesh, we always try to do a kal koidim. But as being a Moira Hira, giving somebody a psak, You can't tell him do this because the thing is also. There was a speaking about a rage of Shailos. Unfortunately, today in the business world, some people fall, and I was once asked a question that the person said he's gonna fall. He can't. It's too hard for him. He's gonna fall, but he has a cheshbon that he'd rather live with a guy instead of a yid because by a guy there's no need this. So, and he wanted to know, is it a correct thing to do? Because at the end, listen, this is what he's doing. But he wants to do hakala kal kodim with this cheshbon. He's a learned person. He went to yeshiva. He knew how to learn. And I told him over to Reb Moshe. I said, there's no such thing. We don't make calculations of cheshbonis with the Eibishter. This is less of a issa than that. A Rav can't say it's mutter. A Rav wants to maybe say this is the Aryeh, this is the Rabbanon. We won't give off the connotation that he's being matter that we can handle. But to tell someone to do this, that like you mentioned from Rosh Weiss and Zilberstein, Reb Moshe was very, very strong about this.
People, unfortunately, have situations where couples are intimate before they're married. So they make a cheshbon, even though they're not married. She's a single woman. So she should go to the mikvah. She should go to the mikvah. At least when they're together, she shouldn't have the tumas nida. So she asks the Rav, can I go to the mikvah? Or what should the policy be? We should allow these women to go to the mikvah. So it's very hard for a Rav to tell a single woman to go to the mikvah so she can be intimate with her boyfriend before they're married.
Just to clarify the point just a little bit, just to make sure that we're all clear on this, there is a rule of hakala kal tchila. That's when the metzius is that an avera must be done. Meaning, like in this case that Rav Elyada raised, the answer to the Shailos pashut, divorce your wife. You're not allowed to live together. That's the halachic answer. The answer is you're not allowed to be married to each other. She's not Jewish. You are Jewish. If she wants to be Gyoris, you're a Kohen. That's the answer to the Shaila. If a person says, yeah, but I'm not going to do that. So now I want to know which Avera to do. That's where we say, no, we can't tell you to do a lesser Avera. It happens to be also in a lot of these cases of Kahuna, though, the first line of defense is to look into how we really know that he's a Kohen. That's the first thing you look at. And then we go from there.